Hi, this is Clare Prezzia, and welcome to another Hero Arts video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this card using the Stealing My Heart stamp set and featuring some tips on how to blend backgrounds using Hero Arts inks. So I'm going to start by stamping the two thieves onto some Bristol cardstock using Hero Arts black ink. This stamp set actually comes with a lot of little add-on images like little robber tools and a mask and some safety boxes or bolts. I didn't use any of those just because I wanted to keep this card pretty simple, but you could really go all out making a scene with these guys. So I'm using my Misty to stamp these because my ink pad I've used a ton. It's kind of beat up. I haven't restocked yet. So I knew it was running just a little bit dry. So instead of stamping, using just a clear block to stamp it and then, having the risk of I missed a spot on the stamps, I can just use my Misty and then stamp it again if I needed to. Usually I don't use the Misty just because I kind of enjoy using the clear blocks, but in this case I didn't want to waste any cardstock. So I did actually stamp it twice because I wanted the black to be really defined, even though the first time stamped pretty well. So I'm coloring these guys using some mostly Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens, and then I also used a distress marker just for a slightly different blue. These Zig pens are one of the reasons why I chose to use Bristol cardstock, because Bristol cardstock and watercolor cardstock both work well with water-based inks, which is what these pens are. And I'm not doing any sort of blending on these cards really. I'm not using various shades of gray to do the pants. It's pretty simple coloring, but the ink just settles a lot better on Bristol or watercolor cardstock or whatever cardstock you have that is meant for water-based inks. So that's why one of the reasons why I decided to use the Bristol cardstock. And I also use the Bristol cardstock because it's going to work very well with the ink blending. So we'll get to that in a sec. But first, now that I have these guys colored and die cut, I'm using one of the Heart Infinity dies. I just used the same size for both of these hearts here. And I use those guys to kind of figure out where I wanted to die cut the hearts, and then I die cut them. So I have my card base already scored and folded. Normally I like to use cardstock that I haven't scored or folded, but in this instance I did have it scored and folded, so I just flattened it out, and then I used some masking tape that was pretty sticky, so I rubbed it on my arm a couple times to take away some of that tackiness, and then I put it on the back side of that card base so I don't have to worry about any ink getting on the back of the card. I'm going to keep that die cut panel to the side just because I'm not going to actually blend the entire front of this card. I'm just going to blend the parts where that you're going to be able to see from the die cut hearts. I mean, you could blend the entire background if you wanted to. I just decided not to. A little bit less time. But, I mean, no one's going to be able to see either unless maybe they're a card maker and they're looking for that. But I'm blending the bottom of the cardstock using cotton candy, and then I'm going to blend the middle using pale tomato. So a couple pointers when you're blending with Hero Arts inks. These are both shadow inks, and if you've ever stamped with the shadow inks, you've noticed that the impression isn't always super crisp. It might look a little blotchy at first when you first stamp it, but give it a couple minutes and the ink really blends out and you get a very nice crisp image after a couple minutes. It's just one of the unique properties of the shadow inks. So that applies when you're blending these backgrounds. The background will look kind of blotchy at first, but if you give it a few minutes, the inks will really start blending together and you'll get a very smooth finish. So one of the ways you can get smoother finishes is by using cardstocks that kind of help that. And I find that watercolor cardstock works the best, but Bristol also works pretty well. So watercolor is meant, you can, depending on the type of watercolor paper that you have, what the quality is, it's specifically meant for water. Bristol, you can use different mediums with it, so it's meant for water, but If you were gonna watercolor some really fancy piece, then you would want to do it on actual watercolor cardstock and not Bristol, just because watercolor cardstock holds up to more water. I'm not sure if that's why the inks kind of seem to blend a little bit smoother onto the cardstock, but the end result is, with Bristol and watercolor cardstock, the inks blend really nicely. I don't think I've tried some Michaels cardstock, and I don't think the ink blended as nicely. It definitely didn't go on the cardstock as easily, and the end result wasn't as blended. So watercolor or Bristol cardstock works really well with the shadow inks. Another thing I like to do, which I didn't do with this card, but whenever I blend backgrounds, sometimes I like to flick some paint on it just for a little bit of interest. Usually white paint, but sometimes maybe a darker color of whatever I just blended. If you heat set the cardstock, or if you give it some time to dry, maybe a couple hours, and then you flick the paint onto it, the paint will usually kind of pop out pretty well depending on what color you're using. But if you flick the paint onto the cardstock before you give it any time to dry or before you heat set it, then the ink will kind of blend in, the ink that you flicked on it will kind of blend in with the inks that you blended, just because they're kind of still blending themselves, so whatever you flicked on is kind of gets caught in that process. So it doesn't usually pop as well, but that could be a look that you're going for. So it all kind of depends on what you're going for. So those are just a couple of tips for when you're blending with the Hero Arts shadow inks. So once I have that card front blended, I am going to go ahead and just use my scoring board to fold it down once again to make sure that it lays pretty flat. And then I'm going to add a bunch of foam adhesive to the back of that die cut panel and then adhere that to the card. Once those are adhered, I'm going to go ahead and add those little robbers that we colored earlier. And before I adhere them down, I want to stamp this little heart, this Love You heart from Yes Stamp and Cut, on a piece of Bristol cardstock. I'm stamping it in Versamark and then heat embossing it with some black sparkle powder. I really quickly added some anti-static powder onto that cardstock before I did any of the stamping, so that's what that little pouch was. And then the last step, after I haven't adhered the little guys down yet, but the last step will be to adhere some little hearts that I had die cut using the heart confetti die from some black sparkle paper that I had made myself by covering a piece of black cardstock with black sparkle embossing powder, and that gives you your own homemade glitter paper. So I just die cut that using the heart confetti die and added some little hearts to the card, and that finished it off. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them on this video or on the blog, and supplies will be linked on the blog. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. God bless.